Good evening, everybody. Good evening from my house, the outskirts of Basingstoke in North Hampshire, about 25 minutes from the Naturetrek office. I've gone almost 2 years with barely talking about Galápagos Islands at all, but as Sarah said, the phones and our email channels have been red hot since the new year, and it's a delight to be talking about the Galápagos again after such a long break. And it's interesting for me, I'm fielding lots of inquiries at the moment, both from people who are planning their first trip to the Galápagos, maybe a once-in-a-lifetime adventure that's been planned for a long time, and also people looking to go back maybe 15 or 20 years after their first visit. And for those of you in that boat, excuse the pun, you're going to see some changes in the Galápagos, and most of them are for the better. More of that in a few moments. So let's get underway and whisk ourselves over to the South American continent for the next 20 minutes, and just first of all get our bearings. We're over on the western coast, the western seaboard of the South American continent. You can see the Republic of Ecuador in green there, a land surface area about the same size as the British Isles. And the Galápagos Islands are 1,500 kilometers or so out into the Pacific Ocean over to the west, the left of this slide, straddling the equator. To get to the Galápagos, we fly into Quito, Ecuador's capital, nestling at 10,000 feet up in the Andes. And then it's a domestic flight, an internal flight for an hour and a half from Quito, often via Guayaquil, Ecuador's principal port city, out to the Galápagos Islands. The airport is on the island of Baltra, which is almost slap bang in the middle of my slide here. And we, over the last 30 years, have specialised in offering 2-week cruises. Now, the norm in Galápagos is to go for a week or less. But over the course of a week, you're only going to see one half of the archipelago. And I know from experience, you go on a cruise like this and you get bitten by the Galapagos bug. And I've spoken to lots of people over the years who have done a 1-week cruise, got to the end of that 1-week cruise and are just kicking themselves because they've so enjoyed it. They wish they'd have invested in the second bolt-on week. So over a 2-week period, we go north up to Tower, we go west and circumnavigate Isabela and see Fernandina. One of my favourite visitor sites is over here in the west at Punta Espinosa on Fernandina, which is the newest geologically of the Galapagos Islands. We explore the central islands, and we also come south and east as well. Española, another highlight, Genovesa here in the south, and San Cristobal. Now, just a second on plate tectonics. We're on the Galapagos Nazca tectonic plate here, which is slipping under the South America plate at a rate of about 6 centimeters a year. So the whole Galapagos Island archipelago is moving in a southeasterly direction at 6 centimeters a year. So down here in the southeast, we have the oldest islands in the Galapagos, about 90 million years old. Whereas up here in the northwest, sitting over the active volcanic plume, we have Isabela, which is active, and also Fernandina, which was erupting just last year. And these islands perhaps poked above the Pacific Ocean about 6 to 8 million years ago. When you first fly into the Galapagos, you look out of the plane window and see rather barren volcanic islands. Nothing really prepares you for the riches that you're going to see shortly when you land and start exploring properly. The choice of boat in Galapagos is a really key component to your trip, and it will shape the fabric of your holiday. We have a long working relationship with 2 family-owned boats, both owned by the same family. Cachalote Explorer here will undertake the majority of our cruises on Cachalote Explorer. She houses 16 guests in 8 double or twin cabins, all en suite. The crew are fantastic, the food's awesome, and as you can see, the boat has some really nice deck space. So our groups like to be up on deck when we're cruising from island to island, looking for seabirds and cetaceans, and enjoying the volcanic scenery as we cruise on past. On a boat like Cachalote Explorer, the cabins are quite tight. You can see here, you haven't got much storage space. You can barely swing a cat, but what I would say is on a cruise like this, you're almost never down below deck. You're down below deck to wash and brush up in the evenings and to sleep. But in the daytime, there's so much going on that you don't really want to be down below deck. You want to be up on deck, or maybe in the ship's library, downloading your latest photos. So the small size of the cabins is not an inconvenience unless you get particularly claustrophobic. You can see the bedding arrangements on Cachalot Explorer are a double bed and then a single upper bunk, with each cabin having its own ensuite facilities, a loo, a hot water shower, and a wash basin. So perfectly comfortable. Cachalot's sister boat is the Beluga, and we run our so-called deluxe cruises on Beluga, normally 2 charters a year. And Beluga's a bit more powerful, a bit larger, and more spacious. A 2-week cruise on Beluga costs about £1,000 more than a cruise on Cachalot Explorer. For your £1,000, what do you get? Well, you get slightly larger cabins, and you get 2 lower berths, either twin beds or a double bed. So you're just paying for a bit more space and a touch more luxury, and just a smidgen more speed through the water. Not that that makes any real difference on a day-to-day basis. The key thing, though, are the crew and the itinerary. And being 2 family-run boats, we can vouch for the quality of the crew and the guide, which is the most important factor of all, because we want a guide who's bilingual, knows their natural history inside out, and also is a good companion, a good people person, a good people manager, and joins us for dinners in the evening and joins in the group spirit and camaraderie. And we get all of those ingredients with these 2 boats, so they come highly recommended. All of the cruises these days are led by Ecuadorian naturalists, and they do a wonderful job. 15, 20 years ago, we used to send out UK-based tour leaders because we weren't so confident of the quality of the local guides. And this lady in the foreground here is Jenny Wiltshire, who some of you may recognise. She's one of our botanical tour leaders, and she and her husband John, who also leads tours for Naturetrek, took advantage of 2 free berths one year. And I'm indebted to John for some of the images in tonight's presentation. So we cruise around in a liverboard fashion. We go ashore on the Zodiacs or Pangas, which is their local Galapagos name. 2 powerful, nicely modern, fitted out Zodiacs here. And we go ashore on these. And then you'll land either by wading ashore on a wet landing, or you'll be deposited onto a wooden or stone jetty for a dry landing. Here on Española, we've headed south. It's a wet landing. You can see ladies there with flip-flops and jelly shoes. And often a welcoming committee here comprises of a Galapagos hawk. The wildlife here is famously approachable, of course. They have lived for millions of years without any intervention from humans at all, so have virtually no fear at all of human beings. And this is manifested also in the approach and behaviour of the hood mockingbirds, one of the subspecies of mockingbirds. When tourists first started visiting Galapagos in numbers in the 1970s, it was quite common for tourists to hand out caps of water and bits of papaya and bananas, but that's long since been stamped out for obvious reasons by the National Park Authority. But the legacy seems to live on, and the animals and birds do sometimes approach you for free handouts. But the rules are very simple. The wildlife can touch you, but you can't touch or interact with it. Hopping around our feet amongst our first landings, especially in the intertidal zone, we will see the ubiquitous yellow warbler. And we'll quickly get to grips with the famous Darwin's finches. There are 13 species of Darwin's finch, presumably all descended from one common ancestor. And the name Darwin will reverberate really around the cruise, and we'll learn a bit about Darwin's visit to the archipelago in 1835 and his subsequent publication of the origin of the species in 1859. So Darwin was a young naturalist on the voyage of the Beagle in 1835. This was 300 years after the Galapagos was first discovered. The archipelago was discovered in 1535 by the 4th Bishop of Panama, Thomas de Belenga. He was en route from Central America to Peru, and his galleon got blown off course by a storm, and him and his men en route to Peru to sort out a dispute between Francisco Pizarro, the conquistador, and his lieutenants, and ended up on the Galápagos Islands. And that was 1535. It's only in the 1970s that Galapagos tourism really started kicking into gear. And the pandemic aside, it's a really important income stream for Ecuador now. Ecuador does rely heavily on tourism, both in the Galapagos and in the mainland, where bird watching contributes significantly to the economy, along with farming and prawn and banana industries. And that makes up Ecuador's principal income stream. But here we are on Española again in the south of the archipelago, one of my favorite islands. And the subspecies of marine iguanas here are larger and more colorful than on any of the other islands. And as we start to walk slowly around the trails, we have to keep strictly to the trails. It's not a free-for-all. We have to stick to the national park trails. We are getting to grips with seabird colonies, stepping our way literally in and around colonies of Nazca boobies here. And we're scanning out to sea for storm petrels on Española. But the seabirds are wonderfully photogenic, as the other speakers will also touch on later on. But here we've got marine iguanas, small youngsters in the foreground to the right. There's a swallowtail gull there to the right. But the Nazca or masked boobies are particularly photogenic. And it's amazing to see the volume of photos that people take on these types of holidays these days. I can vividly remember leading these cruises back in the late 1990s, and people used to carry a Sainsbury's shopping bag full of 60 roll-up films, all waiting to be processed when they come home. But these days, with a lot of people carrying decent digital photographic equipment, people will take 15, 20,000 images on a holiday like this and sift through and get out the best examples. Now, here we're looking at one of the real highlights of a visit to the Galapagos, the waved albatross. It's an Ecuadorian endemic. These magnificent seabirds only breed on 2 islands worldwide, here in Galapagos on Isla Española, and also a small island off the Ecuador coast called Isla de la Plata. They're here from about May to December each year. In August, September, October, they'll be with fluffy chicks waddling to the cliff edge and taking their first huge wing beats out into the Pacific breeze. But it's a wonderful experience just to nestle down next to these magnificent birds and just enjoy their beak-clicking courtship display. And I'm often amazed when I see other tourists, other groups in Galapagos, just walk past at breakneck speed, just giving the birds a cursory glance before they want to get back on board the boat for a cold beer and a swim. And as Sarah touched on, one of the strengths, I think, one of our unique selling points in Naturetrek is when we charter these vessels, the idea very much is to put a group of like-minded people on the boat who you can share a common passion with. So if there's a waved albatross colony that we can sit down next to and spend 2 or 3 quality hours with, we'll definitely do that and not just walk briskly on by. One of the world's most beautiful beaches is on Española, Gardner Bay. Here's some lovely snorkeling just offshore, and a large Galapagos sea lion colony here, patrolled by a beach master. You can see proudly sitting up there in the background. Just need to keep an eye on him, because if we're snorkeling and he's territorial, we can get into some difficulties. So the guides will keep a very close eye on the behaviour of the beach master, and we can just enjoy a snorkel in these serene surroundings. The water's quite chilly. It's about like it is off the south coast of England in August, between about 19 and 22. Now, for my money, that's chilly. And I would be very much encouraging anybody planning a trip to invest £45 or so in one of these shorty wetsuits cut off at the knees and elbows. Just keeps you reasonably snug. I've seen some clients just dive in when it's 17 degrees and not bat an eyelid, but I'm afraid I'm not quite that brave. And I've always found my shorty wetsuit has been a really good investment. The guides and the tour leader will introduce the concept of snorkeling early on during the cruise with a nice gentle swim just off the beach here in fairly shallow and clear water. And people can build up their confidence. If you're not a confident swimmer or aren't used to snorkeling apparatus, you can build up your confidence in a setting like this. And then before you know it, people have gone into the swing of it, and we're enjoying deep water snorkels off offshore reefs with white-tipped reef sharks and the odd Galapagos penguin, marine iguanas, and really anything could swim into view. Green sea turtle here, and a myriad fish, surgeonfish, and lots of these king angel fish, which will enliven our snorkels with plenty of colour. On the 2 weeks, we will certainly have the opportunity, as I mentioned, to circumnavigate the largest of the Galapagos Islands. This is Isabella. And I love this particular day because lots of the exploration during our cruise will be in the intertidal zone. So very much a marine coastal focus. I love getting up into the highlands though, and we'll take a bus ride up onto the higher slopes of Sierra Negra here and have wonderful views out over the volcanic caldera, looking at the high altitudes endemic flora. On the way up, we will be stopping to look for Galapagos land iguanas. This is another endemic species. Again, cameras will be clicking away here. And on the western shores of Isabella, once we're back on the boat and cruising up the western side of Isabella, there are some really peaceful and secluded mangrove swamps here. And this is a nice opportunity to get into the pangas, turn off the outboard, and the guys will just paddle us peacefully through the mangrove swamp. And we can see huge shoals of golden cowrays. There'll be other fish that we can see beneath the water, small colonies of Galapagos penguin, and the odd flightless cormorant and other special wildlife. This indeed is probably the best place in Galapagos to see the Galapagos penguins. Here's one of our groups on the Zodiac enjoying a colony of blue-footed boobies on top of the rock there. But just over to the left, you can hopefully make out a couple of, well, it's actually two Galapagos penguins here showing their white bellies quite well. And you might even be able to make out the ubiquitous Sally Lightfoot crabs there, just to the left of the penguins. And whoever's on this Zodiacs actually sent me the resultant picture of these two Galapagos penguins. Superficially, they're quite similar to Humboldt penguins, which are favoured by children's zoos in the UK. So if you take your children, in the past, taking your children or grandchildren to a zoo here in the UK and seen Humboldt penguins, they're very closely related to the Galapagos penguins. And here, just on the bottom left, you can see the Sally Lightfoot crabs as well. The deep water channel between Isabella and Fernandina comprises some of the richest feeding grounds in the archipelago. Here's a mixed seabird flock of brown noddies and Galapagos petrels and one or two storm petrels, all audible on shearwater as well. So the seabird watchers will be keenly watching developments in this deep water channel. Before we alight on Punta Espinosa, so here we are in Fernandina, as I said at the outset, the newest geologically, speaking of the Galapagos Islands, only about 8 million years old or so. And there's a vast colony of marine iguanas here. And it's one of the lesser visited sites in Galapagos. So sometimes we have this site to our own, to ourselves, or maybe just one or two other boats will be in attendance. So we'll anchor, do a dry landing here. And then what I love to do is with the group, just find your own patch in amongst the iguanas, and you just nestle down with the Pacific breeze in your hair and just kind of absorb this almost primeval atmosphere. The scene hasn't really changed for millions of years. And you just need to be careful that you don't get a face full or expensive camera lens full of marine iguana phlegm. They do tend to clear their nostrils of salt, crystallized salt at quite regular intervals. But they're incredible creatures, and we'll also take the opportunity to snorkel with these animals at some point during the cruise as well. You can maybe imagine what the early sailors, the shipwrecked sailors and the early buccaneers made of this bizarre wildlife. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. And the early explorers really felt it to be an inhospitable, godforsaken place. Very little fresh water, full of strange lizards, not much edible. They couldn't wait to get off and back to the mainland. But for our purposes here in the 21st century, as eco-tourists, it's a unique and fascinating place to go. Here's the flightless cormorant, presumably descended from the neotropic cormorant from the mainland, but in the absence of all land-based predators over the years has seemingly lost its need or ability to fly. Another day away from the coastal ecosystem will see us up in the highlands of Santa Cruz at the two old sinkholes here of Los Gemelos. We need to be careful of crossing giant tortoises during our bus ride up the mountain. But here we'll have a roast chicken or pizza lunch in a local restaurant and spend some time in the wild giant tortoise meadows. And again, a bit like with the marine iguanas, it's an opportunity to find your own private giant tortoise and just nestle down in the grass, see them go about their business. You can even hear the old, heavy, slow heartbeat of these magnificent animals, in some cases hundreds of years old. And we'll also learn about the reintroduction program and the captive breeding program in the Charles Darwin Centre back down on the coast. A long voyage overnight to the north takes us up to Tower Island, or Genovesa, its old Spanish name. And here's another dry landing with some quite precarious looking steps out. Those are Prince Philip steps going up the cliffside there. It's not actually as hard as it looks from this photo, but the efforts were worthwhile, because on top, on the plateau at the top, we'll see a breeding colony of swallowtail gulls, maybe the world's most stunning gull, and the breeding colony of red-footed boobies, the only species of the three boobies which nest in trees as opposed to on the ground. There's an interesting population of short-eared owls up here on Genovesa, a diurnal species, and they specialise in hunting storm petrels. There's a petrel there. If you look carefully at the owl's talon, there's a rather unfortunate petrel there that's been snaffled as it's come out from its burrow. And these short-eared owls, which have a very wide-ranging distribution around the world, prey almost exclusively on those petrels. It's not a strenuous holiday, this, but I always say to people who ask me, do you need to be fit to enjoy it? You do need a certain kind of nimbleness and dexterity, because the terrain underfoot, although we're not walking for any great distance, the terrain is tricky at times. This is the 1953 lava flow on Santiago, which we're exploring. And you can see there the terrain is quite unforgiving. So walking bowls are popular with lots of guests. Back in the central part of the archipelago, North Seymour, blue-footed boobies are always a favourite of visitors, and you can almost see these blue feet when you're trying to go to sleep back at home after the trip, after the holiday's over. I find people can't get those blue feet out of their mind, and they also, like some of the other seabirds, indulge in this sky-pointed courtship display. Also on North Seymour, we have magnificent frigate birds, which at certain times of the year are blowing up their red pouches, and that's a popular subject for the keen photographers during the trip. But most people's favourite, I'd wager, are probably the Galapagos sea lions, particularly if you're a keen swimmer and snorkeler. They're just so lovable and approachable and playful, particularly beneath the waves. It's heartbreaking during an El Nino year, or a year in which the fishing is difficult. You do see quite a lot of death and decay in these colonies, but that only happens every 10 to 15 years or so. Otherwise, it's a wonderful hunting ground and playground for these young sea lions just offshore. So just to finish my talk, that's the most famous viewpoint, arguably, in the Galapagos, with Pinnacle Rock here on the island of Bartolome. Santiago, where the group were walking over the lava flow just a few slides ago, that's over here in the background. We'll anchor just off to the right of the image, walk to the top of Bartolome, have a look over Pinnacle Rock, and then we'll go back down and swim around Pinnacle Rock here, where there's often white-tipped sharks and Galapagos penguins. And then we can walk across the Isthmus of Land to this beach here, where there are often lots of rays and sharks beneath the waves there. So it's a magnificent place. It's unique in so many respects. Since I last went in the early 2000s, they've managed to eradicate all of the goats from the larger islands. So the big change that I mentioned at the outset, if you go back, will be that the Galapagos vegetation and endemic plants are so much healthier now than they were 15 or 20 years ago. The visitor numbers are managed much more effectively. And there's some great conservation stories that have happened in Galapagos over the past 15 to 20 years. So I can't recommend it highly enough. The boats we use also a great choice, and I'll be very happy to have a chat with anybody to answer any questions.